This nation was founded on the principle that all men are created equal.
We hold these truths to be self-evident.
That all men
are
created equal.
I'll tell you what freedom is to me. No fear. I mean, really, no fear.
Created equal.
From WDET in Detroit, this is Created Equal. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm in the studio with Carrie Jr. II, our show's producer.
Hello.
Yeah, so today we want to continue the conversations that we're trying to have about the way that we react to poverty when we see it. And this is inspired, of course, by Judge Kenneth King of the 36th District Court here in Detroit, responding to an impoverished teenager sleeping in his courtroom during a field trip by really embarrassing her in a terrible and unempathetic way, dressing her in prison garb and handcuffing her. It made me think about poverty and the way that all of us see it or don't see it and the way that we respond to it. Today, we want to talk with a professor who talks about how the mistaken assumptions we make about how tough poor people are often lead us to inappropriate responses to their lives.
He's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park, and so he studies beliefs and about poverty and social class. So we're going to be talking about psychological research called the thick-skin bias. College Park is a professor who wrote a paper about this and researched this topic. And what it really is the idea that folks who have challenging backgrounds or live in poverty have thicker skin, so they can take more adverse situations than some folks who may be of higher status who aren't in more challenging circumstances. And so we don't offer those people support when they very well may need more support than people who don't face those same circumstances.
Yeah. Well, and in so many ways, that's upside down, that thinking that somehow vulnerable people are less vulnerable than people who don't walk through the world experiencing those vulnerabilities, who have far more control over what happens to them and their families. It's a counterintuitive bias that exists, I think, in all of our minds. And one of the things I want to ask the professor about is, where does that come from? Why do we have it so upside down and so backward? What is it about our culture that tells us that the vulnerable among us somehow can take it and everybody else has to be coddled in a way? Okay, Nathan Cheek, professor of psychology at the University of Maryland, College Park. Welcome to Created Equal.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's start here. A lot of what you study is about the way that those of us who don't live in poverty react to those who do. The beliefs that we have about them, about social class, about responsibility and fault, and all of these things that kind of churn through, I think, the narrative about economic opportunity and inequality in America. So I'm really curious to have you paint a thumbnail for us of what we see when we encounter somebody who's living in poverty, and I guess how distorted that image is, how wrong we are about the assumptions we make, I guess, about people who are poor when we see them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what my research suggests is that when we see people in poverty, or we judge that somebody is relatively low income, we might tend to think that they are somehow less vulnerable to harm than they actually are, that they've been sort of quote unquote toughened by the hardship that they have experienced and have grown a thicker skin and are more resilient and more tough than higher income people, even in situations where we know objectively somebody with fewer material resources would actually be more harmed, more impacted. And so it seems like people have this widespread idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, that they sometimes apply to people in poverty to think that people in poverty are tough and are not vulnerable to harm, and therefore they fail to see suffering that might be right in front of them and might be otherwise obvious if we didn't have this kind of belief.
And is part of that about the idea that we think they need, quote, tough love in order to be in a different place? In other words, that we believe them to be coddled in some way or indulged in some way that hasn't inspired them to do more.
I think they're definitely related. So there's a lot of rhetoric and beliefs around the idea that people in poverty are lazy or are unmotivated or are free riding on welfare systems and taking advantage of quote unquote hardworking taxpayers and ideas like that. And I think that goes hand in hand with the idea that people in poverty are tough and are less vulnerable to harm in their circumstances, because both of those beliefs feed into this idea that people in poverty are actually doing okay, and actually their lives are not that urgently in need of intervention. And in fact, maybe what they really need is some kind of policy mechanism or incentive or push to work harder and to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which is sort of a classic American mythology around poverty and success.
Yeah. So give us some examples of the way that this presents when we, I guess, encounter somebody who's living in poverty, and the way that we react. How does this play out in people's lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can play out in lots of different circumstances. I think one context that you see a lot is when people ask for help. So that might be people who are on the street asking for passersby to help them, or are experiencing some kind of particular need, like they're in a doctor's office or they're in a classroom trying to get a teacher's attention. We often see that higher income people across all of those situations get more attention and get more care, and they get attention for longer, and the attention they get is more careful, and they're listened to better. And I think that kind of attention that we disproportionately focus on higher income, higher SES individuals can stem from these kinds of beliefs where, on the one hand, higher SES individuals might be seen as more in need, more vulnerable, having thinner skin, which is, ironic, but might focus attention on their needs. And then hand in hand with this idea of laziness or of tough love, you might also see people be more empathetic towards higher SES people because they perceive them as working hard and running into problems based on external factors, whereas they might be blaming people in poverty for their own circumstances, which can harden us, make us less empathetic and less likely to help, whether it's someone coming up to a stranger on a street asking for directions, or somebody seeking professional help. And I think one nice research study that looked at this was a field study where researchers had research staff get onto different buses and pretend that they didn't have fare to ride the bus. And what they found was bus drivers were more likely to let people take a free ride when that person was dressed in a way that suggested they were higher income, even though you might think actually somebody who has higher income has more options. If they can't ride the bus, for example,
Right.
they might be able to call an Uber or whatever. So you can sort of see this play out in those kind of situations.
Right. So the person who gets on the bus in a suit and says, "Oh, I'm short, I don't have the fare," is more likely to get accommodation from the driver than the person who comes on in maybe jeans and a torn T-shirt and maybe looks like they don't have a place to live. There's more intolerance directed at the person who looks like they need more.
Exactly.
And what is it about us that makes us react that way? Like, where are we getting that from? What is the I guess the origin of that thought? Because it's upside down, right? It is not responding to need, which is one of the, I think, kind of innate human traits that I think would like to ascribe to ourselves, right? That we are compassionate people and empathetic people, and that we respond to people based on what they present as need. Here, that's the opposite. So what's happening there? What's breaking down in that human response that makes us more compassionate to the quote unquote wealthy person and less to the person in poverty?
Yeah, I think it's a complex question, but I think a big part of it is that we are deeply uncomfortable with injustice and inequality, and we have a deep motivation to believe in a just world, a world that is fair, where people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. And so it's really threatening to us when we confront inequalities and confront socioeconomic disparities, and when we confront suffering. It feels bad. Both sort of cognitively as we think about it, but also emotionally. We have a visceral reaction against that kind of injustice. And so one of the strategies that people adopt to get through life is adopting beliefs that justify inequality, which can include things like blaming people in poverty for their own circumstances, which makes it then not a societal problem, but really just this one person isn't working hard enough. But if they did work harder, then they could pull themselves up. And so actually the world is okay. And at the same time, we have this belief that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, because we want to make meaning out of hardship and suffering. And so if you can interpret suffering as a path to growing stronger and developing better skills for the future, then hardship doesn't seem so bad, and we don't have to confront the discomfort and deep stress of watching other people suffer in an unequal system, particularly for higher income people who have to deal with this dissonance of benefiting from an unequal system and being towards the top of the hierarchy.
Right.
And those people might be particularly motivated to engage in these kinds of beliefs that help us navigate the world and make us feel better about ourselves and our place in it.
Yeah, this Carrie here, Professor Cheek, sorry, a little curveball, but it made me think of a scenario, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about it. This bus example made me think of when we're kind of walking on the street and we engage with folks who ask for money for a number of different things. We don't know what the reason is, but I feel like sometimes we would be more like we often assume what they would do with that money if we were to give it to them, and that's kind of determining whether we'd give it or not. So I guess my question really is, what does it say about how we're assessing people who look like they may be coming from a more challenging background and their behavior? Like, what does that also say about that? Because I know you speak to their circumstances and whether or not you get what you deserve, but does it say anything, or is there anything in your research or from your background that you could speak to about how we assume people's behavior given the background we also assume as well?
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think that those kind of assumptions about, the money would just be spent on alcohol or something else that we don't deem as appropriate, feeds into and comes from this kind of idea that we blame people in poverty for their own circumstance. We don't trust people in poverty. We don't believe that there are, or we underappreciate systemic factors, and we're blaming them for their own circumstances. So we assume this person is asking for money because they aren't working and they are lazy, and other stereotypes about drinking or drugs, and then also therefore the money we give them will just go back into that. So I think they're really related to each other, and I think it also speaks to just a general negative stereotyping of people in poverty and these ideas about what leads you to need money or to be experiencing housing insecurity and what feeds back into that. And in this particular example, there's also a sort of recent field demonstration of this, where a team of researchers had a man stand on the side of the street in different neighborhoods and either wear a suit or wear more casual clothing and actually ask people for money as they passed by, and people donated more money when the man was wearing a suit. So I think directly speaking to what you're saying and the kind of inferences people make about what the money might be spent on.
This kind of reminds me of sorry to go on a slight tangent, but just kind of reminds me of, for a pop culture reference, the show, What Would You Do on ABC? I used to love watching that show, and they would always give examples about how people would respond based off of the way someone looked or dressed, and more often you see that people would respond more favorably when they were dressed, quote unquote, appropriately or, professionally.
We're going to go to a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with psychology professor Nathan Cheek about the way we react to people who live in poverty. We're back with more Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and our guest is Nathan Cheek. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Maryland at College Park. We are talking about the way in which those of us who don't live in poverty react to the people we see and encounter who do live in poverty. Let's get back to the conversation. So I want to talk now about the specific example that made me start thinking about the ways in which we respond to signs of poverty and people who we think are poor. And it's, I guess it's not exactly what we've been talking about. But this instance here in Detroit where a judge reacts to a teenager who's sleeping in his courtroom during a field trip by getting angry with her and accusing her of being disrespectful of him and of the courtroom, and then goes even further and punishes her eventually by having her dressed in prison clothes and handcuffed in the courtroom to make an example of her. The reason I got to the question of what this tells us about how we see poverty, of course, is because it was revealed later that the reason this 15-year-old was tired on the field trip was because she and her mother don't have secure housing. They are kind of floating around and trying to find places to stay each night, and they had been out late trying to do that the night before, so she was tired. There are a number of things about this case that of course have gotten a lot of attention, but the thing that keeps kind of getting me worked up is that the judge did not know this teenager was impoverished or housing insecure. He reacted, though, to what he saw her doing as disrespect because, well, in a courtroom you can't sit there and sleep, and I think any of us would agree with that standard. But it made me think about the ways in which we react to people frequently in ways that don't try to acknowledge the possibility of their lives, right? That jump to conclusions about who they are and what they're experiencing and edge out any possibility that poverty is one of the things driving their behavior. And it made me think that we are probably doing that an awful lot. We are walking through the world and not really understanding or even taking the time to acknowledge that poverty has a profound effect on people, and that is on display in many, many different ways every day around us, that there are inescapable things that people in poverty are dealing with, and we are reacting in a way that doesn't even see them in a sense.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really true, and I think this is an example, a recent and horrifying example of that general tendency to not think about what potential situational factors could be affecting people's behavior and really focusing on internal individual explanations like disrespect or laziness or disinterest or other kinds of negative attributions that we make for people's behavior. And it relates to a long tradition in psychology that has shown that, particularly in the United States, we have a tendency to over-explain people's behavior by attributing it to their own personality or their own dispositional characteristics and not taking into account the potential effects of external factors and situations. And poverty is one example where we really often are numb to the effect that those kinds of external factors can have. And I think this is one example of that, where the judge interpreted this kind of behavior as disrespectful, but also understood it as something that was coming from individual characteristics that had to be punished as a way to change behavior. Whereas, of course, that we know that punishment wasn't going to do anything. It wasn't going to change future outcomes because it didn't solve the core problem and the core root of the exhaustion. And so a general tendency to take a punitive stance, which I think we see more broadly in the US in how we design welfare systems, where our entire welfare system in the US is kind of based around shame and punishment and discouragement instead of dignity and empowerment and a recognition that you actually can, support people and that can help them get back on their feet and improve their lives and have a social safety net. Instead, it's all about ways in which welfare benefits are so shamed and discouraged to be used.
Can you talk more about that? This idea of how we render welfare and other social safety net programs in this country so that they do seem punitive, so that they do seem to be associated with shame or embarrassment rather than the link to opportunity that they're supposed to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think you see it in a lot of political rhetoric. You see it in this idea that people are free riding on benefits, that benefits are demotivating people, that a social safety net makes people lazy. But I think you see it also in the extent to which there's an entire bureaucracy around benefits that requires people to do an enormous amount of logistical work to even access these benefits. There's an enormous sort of disheartening rudeness that people are treated with when they try to navigate these systems. They're confronted with at least apathy, if not active antipathy, when they try to get benefits that they're, theoretically entitled to some extent. And, you see this also in, for example, work incentives that make benefits contingent on some kind of evidence that people are actively working and that they're not just being lazy and that they're, being good, quote unquote, good contributors to society and all these other things that make it so that people in poverty are seen inherently as untrustworthy and as unworthy and as, lacking a dignity that doesn't have to come with benefits and wouldn't have to come with, a way of thinking about social safety nets as a normal, important part of a society that inevitably involves some people needing help sometimes. And I think that a lot of that traces back to this idea that we blame people in poverty for their own circumstances. And so we don't see poverty as something that it makes sense to have structural solutions to when people experience it. We see it as a personal problem that maybe people can get some help during, but they need to prove that they're hardworking and that they are, only going to temporarily need these benefits as they pull themselves back up.
Yeah. So you talk a lot about the assumed resiliency that we assign to poor people. In this case, in the case of this judge and this teenager in his courtroom, it seems that there's another dynamic that I think is really important, and that is the invisibility of poverty, right? There are a lot of people who struggle with very basic, economic realities, housing, food, the things that most of us just kind of take for granted. And we don't see them because in some cases they're not in the same spaces that we are. But often when they are in those spaces, they become invisible, or their poverty becomes invisible to us, and that in some cases can lead us to the kind of responses that we have that seem insensitive or uncaring, because we're just not even thinking about, well, maybe the problem that this person is experiencing has to do with the fact that they don't have a place to live, or that they don't have food every day, or that they don't have transportation, that there is something about those conditions in our culture right now that is unseen.
Yeah, no, I think that's really true. And I think like you said, it's a combination of the sort of income segregated lives we live, where a lot of the times people are literally not encountering people in different social classes than themselves, or at least not paying attention to people who aren't in their same socioeconomic bracket. But I think you're right. We don't see somebody's full life. When they're in front of us, we see them and their immediate behavior. And it's easy to try to explain their behavior through some kind of, personality explanation, but we don't see the full reality of their lives. And so you see in classrooms, teachers might respond negatively to students who are sleeping in class or who weren't able to complete the homework assignment and are blaming the student for laziness and not trying hard enough, when of course that student is exhausted because they're working jobs or they're trying to support their family or they don't have secure housing and they're looking for a place to sleep. And so you have all kinds of realities that we're sometimes blind to. And I think the US has a lot of narratives around the American dream and what a just world looks like that help us stay blind to those kinds of circumstances and help us not attend to the realities of poverty in ways that might open our eyes to other kinds of circumstances like that. So I think it's a really big problem. And I think, it's just related to that. There's research that suggests that it's not that people can't make these kinds of explanations. Mm-hmm. And when you give people explicit information about income inequality and a lack of income mobility and what our current social structure means for people who are experiencing poverty, you see people's attitudes towards individuals in poverty become more positive. You see people make more situational explanations for people's behavior and blame people in poverty less. And you see them become more supportive of public policies and business policies aimed towards helping people. And so it's not like many people aren't able to understand these kinds of circumstances, but the way we're living our lives right now and the narratives we have around poverty are leading us to make different kinds of explanations and attributions rather than the more structural ones that might help us access empathy and offer help.
Mm-hmm. Professor Cheek Carey here again. So I kind of want to reference a point you made earlier about how people are making conclusions about folks who live in poverty and not fully understanding that it's really the context and the circumstances in which they live that create these certain behaviors, and it doesn't define them in that way. I guess you could argue this is a devil's advocate question. Is it fair to some extent to say that people are a product of their environment, right? And that part of what we're experiencing, whether it's poverty or something else, is part of how they present in the world, right? Like, can't we come to some conclusion about who this person might be or present or how they feel based off of their behavior, regardless of the fact of their circumstances? Or is that an unfair assessment?
Oh, interesting. I think that it's certainly true that people's environment and lived experience shapes their behavior in both small and very large ways. And so I think it is true. Like, I think in the same way that like the way to understand this young student's behavior is to understand that she was experiencing housing insecurity and was exhausted, those behaviors are a result of her circumstances. So I think it's definitely true to say that we're products of our environment in many ways, although certainly we also have, there are genetic factors that explain our behavior. There's random factors that explain our behavior. But and I think what might help us have a kinder and more empathetic society is to say, recognizing that people are at least somewhat products of their environment involves recognizing that context matters and social structures matter and poverty matters. And so if we see behaviors that we think are disrespectful or we think are problematic, a way to tackling them, especially at a more widespread, larger level, is to address the environment and change behaviors by changing the environment. If we're worried about people speeding, we can try to punish individual drivers, or we can build roads and policies that make people naturally drive slower, which I think is salient to me because I live somewhere where lots of roads have cameras that automatically photograph you if you're speeding. And so people drive much better than they do in Boston, where I grew up, where there are no cameras. And so similarly, if we're worried about behaviors and we don't want people to fall asleep when they shouldn't, we can think about, well, we can try to punish individual people and put that responsibility on them, or we could try to change their life circumstances in such a way where they don't have to be exhausted or they don't have to have these other concerns that are overriding, the need to be like awake and present and respectful in a courtroom. And that is, I think, a more empathetic way of responding to, behaviors that we might be blaming people for.
When we come back, we will conclude our conversation with psychology professor Nathan Cheek about the way we react to people who live in poverty. Stay where you are. We'll be right back with more Created Equal. This is Created Equal from WDET in Detroit. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm talking with Nathan Cheek, a professor of psychology at the University of Maryland at College Park. We're talking about the ways that we react to people who live in poverty. Let's get back to our conversation. So I want to talk a little about unlearning these kinds of biases and how we go about that. And again, I want to start with this judge here in Southeast Michigan. This is somebody who every day has people brought before him who certainly are experiencing, crisis in their lives, and many of them are crises that are related to poverty. If this person doesn't see that, can't see that, and can't react in a way that reflects some empathy for that. It seems like we're really far from the ideal, which would be that all of us would be able to see that. I mean, this is someone with great responsibility and authority. So if you're thinking about how to change the way people see this and react to it, where do you even start?
I think it's a really, it's the fundamental question, and it's one that social psychologists have been trying to tackle for decades, and it's really complicated and really, I think, concerning, like you said, that people in power who also are confronted by poverty and hardship on a daily basis aren't somehow becoming more empathetic as they experience people in those circumstances. I think one key to unlocking a better understanding is experiences that help people recognize the reality of poverty or the reality of other lived experiences. And so that can encourage perspective taking. And one major route to that kind of understanding that psychologists study is what we call contact, which is just getting to interact with people. But what we know about contact, so for example, someone who's high income, meeting and interacting with and learning from someone who's in poverty, we know that there have to be specific circumstances in that interaction for contact to have a better chance of reducing prejudice and stereotyping. And so one of the major factors is equal status. It has to feel like people are on the same level and not someone in a high position of power looking down on someone in their courtroom or, some other subordinate. And then we know that other important factors in that situation are some kind of mutual goal or a tendency to want to work together and an interdependence that makes people motivated to connect with the person they're interacting with. And I think right now we have a society that's structured to disincentivize that kind of contact across income levels. And so thinking about ways to bring people into contact and share stories, and that can be through media, that can be through politicians trying to change narratives, or public speakers and advocates and activists trying to introduce new kinds of narratives to people's lives. But it can also be through more directed experiences. There's an online web tool or web game called Spent, where people simulate life in poverty. They get basically a budget for 1 month, and they try to make it through the end of the month without running out of money, as the game randomly throws them different kind of realistic life events, like your car breaks down or your family member needs some money for dinner or something like that. And the, I think, powerful influence this game has is that it's almost impossible to make it through the month, at least on your first try. And what research suggests is that when high-income people play that game, they come out of it with less prejudice and less stereotyping towards people in poverty and more support for public policies that are aimed at alleviating poverty. And I think it shows that people need some kind of insight into this experience. And I think in a courtroom, a lot of the time, the defendant doesn't have the voice that they might need to be able to engage that kind of perspective taking. And so thinking about, in a courtroom in particular, how can we reorient the interactions that happen there to give voice to people's experiences? And also, how can we make sure that low-income defendants have the legal advocacy that they need and not, a well-meaning but incredibly busy public defender who, within the confines of the court system, isn't able to help a judge understand somebody's full lived experience.
Yeah. And I guess the second part of the question is back to this issue of invisibility.
Mm-hmm.
There are things that people do or ways that people react that are connected to their economic status that the rest of us don't pick up on. This judge in the courtroom, great example. This teenager's tired. He thinks she's being disrespectful. He doesn't stop for a second even to think, well, maybe this is someone in distress, and my response ought to meet that distress. How do we get ourselves and people in authority to understand more about the ways that poverty affects behavior and the many ways that people's lives end up being shaped in almost every way by their economic circumstances?
Yeah, I think it's a big question, and I think we have to think about how we can get people to do what decision scientists often call consider the opposite, which is when you take some time explicitly to say, okay, this was my first intuitive response, but what are other possible explanations that could be more accurate in this situation? And it's about trying to get people to slow down, to pause, and to reassess the initial judgment that comes to mind. So initially we think, why is this person being so rude? And then slowing down and saying, okay, well, something might be going on. And maybe they aren't being rude. Maybe something else is causing their behavior and they actually want to be respectful, but they can't in this situation for whatever reason. And so it's a question of, how do we, in our daily lives, whether we're in a professional setting like a courtroom or a classroom, or just we're, interacting with somebody we encounter as we walk down the street, how do we break those patterns and how do we teach people to have better responses? And I think some of that is, influencing people through whatever routes we can, through media, through radio shows that get people to think differently, through public engagement with science, through lots of different ways of trying to get people to reconsider. But I think also trying to build an empathy for each other that I think we don't have right now, or certainly don't have for everyone we encounter right now. And I think that will involve a lot more, productive and effective contact across income brackets, and a lot more reconfiguring how people navigate the world such that they actually interact with and listen to and take the perspective of people who have different economic circumstances than them. And I think we're a long way off from any kind of widespread way of doing that. But I think there are also examples that show people can do this. So there's some research in political science that looked at canvassing for political causes and showed that when canvassers can get people to relate other people's experiences who are really different from them to their own kind of experiences, they can start to change their mind. And so in one study, for example, that isn't related to poverty, but had people, it was canvassing about laws related to trans people and their rights. And the procedure had people imagine a time when they felt discriminated against or marginalized or unseen, and then linking that to what trans people might experience, and this idea that can unlock empathy. And so I think that's an example of what could also possibly be useful in the context of economic inequality, where you can have people remember a time where they didn't act in a way they wanted to, maybe just because they were tired, maybe just because they were stressed or they were busy. And so it doesn't have to be about money, but unlocking that understanding that, oh yeah, we often act in ways that don't live up to our own expectations or don't follow through on what we would ideally like to do because of our lived experience. And that can be maybe a path to more
Sure.
empathy towards people in poverty.
This is Carrie again. This actually kind of makes me think of an interesting kind of conflict in the idea you just set out, Professor Cheek. First I had a question, but after you just gave that answer, it's more of a comment now, because what you just outlined is kind of an isolated training that folks have to engage in to change their mindsets, so that when they engage with folks who are from more impoverished backgrounds, they can then react to them in a better way. But the conflict that I'm thinking about is how the person who's probably coming from an impoverished background has these circumstances and challenges that make it harder for them to engage in the best way. These are just kind of me. I'm adding this to this. I guess you can correct where I'm wrong. That makes it harder for them to engage to show up as their best self, right? I imagine you don't have to be impoverished to also go through certain challenges, to also not show up as your best self. So the conflict I'm thinking about is, for folks to be able to respond to the person who is dealing with those challenges, must also be managing their own challenges properly enough to recognize that, hey, I need to be empathetic in this scenario. And I just thought that was an interesting kind of conflict that they would have to go through. But I imagine the kind of training idea that you just proposed is that it takes you out of that scenario, right? Like, you don't have to, on a split second, recognize that, suppress all of your challenges, recognize their challenges, be empathetic all at the same time. You've already done that work to be able to recognize it kind of on impact. But that was just an interesting conflict I thought about.
No, I think it's really interesting, and it's a great point because, yeah, I think the hope with prejudice reduction strategies is that over time, the more empathetic response becomes the automatic response.
Right.
And so, but I think you're pointing to this really important finding in psychology, which is that the problem with biases is that it takes energy and time and effort to overcome them when they start to influence our judgments. And so then you can think about ways that, in a case like a professional setting, we may need to restructure how we do our work to try to encourage us to pause and think. And so there's some research that suggests, for example, when hiring committees have to write a justification for why they are not hiring somebody who might otherwise be qualified, it sometimes reduces discrimination because it makes the group pause, have to think about their explicit reasoning and say, oh, actually, this person is qualified. We're just judging them on something that doesn't matter, or we're letting our biases seep in. And the idea is that the justification is making you stop and think and reassess. And I think, how do we build that into our everyday social interactions? I don't know, especially when I think so many of us feel busy, so many of us feel tired. It's so hard to be your best self. But I think trying to find ways to slow down as we train new empathetic responses. And I think that just comes through practice. And, it's the same as building any kind of habit, which is that it's really hard at first and then starts to become more automatic. So, shifting your behavior so that you take the stairs instead of the elevator, or shifting your behavior. Like, these are all things that are really, really hard. And you have to just try to build systems that make them as easy as possible. And then it's just a lot of work that people have to be willing to do, and not everybody will be able to do it, and not everybody will be willing to do it. But, I think we can think about ways to make it somewhat easier. And I do think that changing narratives around poverty gives people other stories that they can more quickly draw on, which makes the process of saying, wait, what if it's this, easier, because there are other explanations that come to mind more quickly. Whereas if we're really distanced from the experience of poverty and we're really not feeling empathy and perspective taking, then we can stop and say, wait, am I making a biased judgment? But then nothing else comes to mind as an alternative, and then it doesn't do any good.
So before we end, I'm curious about what led you to this area of study. It's kind of unusual.
Oh yeah. Thank you for that question. I think what led me to study this topic was a sense that There's a lot of suffering in the world that happens right in front of us that we aren't recognizing. And a lot of psychology has focused on the biases that prevent us, that let us explain away the suffering. So, for example, blaming the victim, blaming people in poverty for their own circumstance. But the idea with that kind of research is that we are recognizing suffering to some extent, but we're just finding attributions for it that make it less uncomfortable. So we're saying, yes, poverty can be hard, but it's people's own fault. And if they worked hard, they could solve their own problems. And I was interested in when we actually fail to see the harm of poverty in and of itself. So we're not explaining it away, we're just not seeing it. And what renders that invisible, and what renders people's pain unseeable and unnoticeable, and what kind of biases might be playing into that. And then I got interested in this idea that hardship breeds toughness, that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I think it's such an intuitive belief that when I talk about this work, sometimes people say, well, that's just true. That's not a bias. That's just true. And they really want it to be true, and they want it to be true for their own lives, and they want it to be true for other people's lives. And so I think what made me think that this is important is this idea that it's intuitive to people and it's really compelling, and that is what makes it so pernicious.
Wow. Okay, Nathan Cheek, it was really great to have you here with us on Created Equal. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This has been great.
One, thanks for letting me jump in. I don't. Whenever we talk about kind of psychology, sociology stuff, I always get really, really curious, because I'm always wondering, like, what's the root of how we innately respond to certain things?
Right.
For me, I think the big thing that he spoke to was that we should slow down. I mean, it wasn't a major point that Professor Cheek made, but it just made me think of that. I'm like, you know what? Whenever I'm at my best, it's when I've had time to really, like, take my time, think, but also just, like, be aware of myself and how I respond, and think, wait, is that the proper response? Am I assessing how I would naturally behave in this way? And so, because we have so much going on with all the media in the world, and all the technology makes everything so much more efficient, I think it's harder to do that nowadays.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there are so many things that tell us to respond instantly to things. Social media being, of course, the most garish, I think.
The news cycle.
You're right. And the news cycle, this endless news cycle, that you have to have something to say, and something to say immediately. And that it has to be perfect, too. That you don't go back and say, well, I said that and thought that, but now that I've had some time, I think differently. And I think that has a lot to do with this dynamic that we're talking about, the way people respond to poverty, the way Judge King responded to this teenager was a great example. If you'd taken a pause and thought for a second, you might have come up with a more empathetic way of dealing with the situation, instead of jumping to the conclusion that this was disrespect and deserving of an outsized kind of punishment. That'll do it for this edition of Created Equal. Created Equal is produced by Carrie Jr. II and David Lines. Our audio editing is by Connor Anderson, and the music is by Sam Bobian. Remember, you can listen to recent episodes of the show at WDET.org. Check us out on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe and to rate the show. You can also leave us a review. If you like what you hear from our WDET programming, please support the station. We are always taking donations. And to do that, you just head over to our website and click the donate button at the very top of the page. If your business cares about civil conversations, about equity, about opportunity in our community, Created Equal is the place that we're having conversations like that. Your sponsorship of this program will keep those conversations going and expand our ability to have them. You can sponsor this program at wdet.org/sponsorship. Created Equal is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University.